For joining ThreatX's platform demonstration of how to block credential stuffing at scale. My name is Cindy Cafaro, and I'm a senior product marketer here at ThreatX. And today, I'll be taking you through a high-level demonstration of how ThreatX combats one of the most prevalent cybersecurity threats of our time, credential stuffing attacks. Credential stuffing has become one of the most significant concerns for individuals and organizations due to hackers leveraging massive collections of stolen usernames and passwords to systematically gain unauthorized access. The consequences can be devastating, leading to compromised user accounts, data breaches, financial losses, and also the trust of consumers. According to Okta, credential stuffing accounts for 34% of all login attempts. That means 1/3 of all attempts to access account information are malicious or fraudulent. Now, taking a look at the growth of stolen credentials sold on the dark web, it makes sense that attackers are using this data to their advantage. As of 2022, 24 billion username and password combinations were found for sale on the dark web, compared to 15 billion 2 years prior in 2020. That's a 60% increase within those 2 years. Lastly, Verizon's DBIR team recently published their annual data breach investigation report, which includes research and findings on 13,000 security incidents and 5,000 data breaches between November 1st, 2021 and October 31st, 2022. From that research, it was identified that the top technique used to breach web applications was the use of stolen credentials. What's being seen in the wild is a credential crisis. Taking a look at credential stuffing attacks from the attacker perspective, it's important to understand that threat actors have two primary options when it comes to botnets. They can either rent existing botnets or create their own. Botnets are networks of compromised computers, also known as bots, that are controlled by a single command and control server. One notorious example of a botnet is the Mirai botnet. It gained significant action between the time of 2016 when it infected over 400,000 devices worldwide. These infected devices or member bots were utilized by hackers to carry out various malicious activities. So let's go ahead and explore the role of how bots act in modern attacks. First, we have bot reconnaissance. Bots are often used to gather information about potential targets, scanning networks and identifying vulnerabilities in applications and APIs. Once the vulnerabilities are identified, hackers leverage bots to launch low and slow targeted attacks. These attacks exploit the weaknesses found during reconnaissance, enabling the attackers to gain unauthorized access or control over sensitive systems. In addition to targeted attacks, botnets are also used for large volumetric attacks. These involve overwhelming a target system with a massive amount of traffic, such as DDoS or denial of service, or hackers can utilize botnets for account takeover, where they hijack a user account or can even abuse APIs by manipulating and misusing their functionality. Finally, we have bot diversion. In this tactic, threat actors employ bots to divert the attention of security systems or analysts by generating a large amount of noise or decoy activity. This diversionary tactic aims to hide the real attack and make it harder for defenders to detect and respond in a timely manner. Now, taking a look at credential stuffing attacks from the security analyst perspective, one of the main challenges that security operations centers, SOCs, and threat hunting teams run into is trying to determine what's noise versus an attack when looking at millions or even billions of requests in their logs. While you can use automation to detect anomalies or malformed traffic, accounting for all modifications to headers and body content isn't ideal. When security analysts are hunting for outliers in HTTP traffic, there are a few characteristics they should look out for. First is user agents. While attackers can easily rotate user agents, most benign or popular scanner bots will customize their user agents to a specific string to provide some sort of identification in the host. Second is TLS fingerprints. They can offer insight into what low-level libraries are being used on both client and server side, supplying a more complex picture of the real attacker behind requests being made. Although rotating fingerprints is possible, this information can still be used to detect less sophisticated attacks. Third, targeted URIs. This is where knowledge of the application or host that the request is trying to reach can come in handy. For example, a request is trying to log in against a WordPress's login endpoint, but the target application doesn't use either. This isn't normal user behavior, so you could be a bit more suspicious about the IP where the traffic is coming from. Next, arguments and body content. This knowledge is key to detecting what should be allowed against an application you're trying to protect. This is one of the main pain points for automated traffic analysis, since the variability of endpoints and the payloads that can be accepted by the application must be properly tracked and understood to provide better protection coverage. The type of arguments or data that can be sent to the application can provide insight into what normal traffic should look like. And when there is an attack trying to bypass current protection, it's common that these values are manipulated or constantly changed. Lastly, source IPs. This is a basic check for source IP information and can be used to determine the intent of a request by combining it with the other metadata that we mentioned above. Nowadays, this is becoming more difficult to use as a clear separator due to the ubiquitous existence of hosting and cloud providers such as AWS EC2, VPS services like DigitalOcean, etc. Also, the distribution of these can help us understand the speed and magnitude of an attack or a scan. While this is an exhaustive list, it provides a baseline to start digging into the traffic and isolating the real attacks from the noise. Let's put some of these guidelines to use as we take a deep dive into ThreatX. Our botnet console is designed to help security teams stay ahead of advancing botnets with API and application protection that evolves with changing behavior. In this case, we're going to be investigating a botnet that's attempting to stuff various username and password combinations to try to gain unauthorized access. Focusing on this brute force credential stuffing botnet, there's a few specific attributes that we can start to track about its behavior. The first attribute that we can focus on is this botnet's risk score, and it represents how malicious of activity is being generated from all of the member bots being tracked. Next, we have threat type. This could be a threat actor, but in this case, we're recognizing that this is a botnet. Also, we recognize the intensity is low for this botnet. Next to that, we have the max level. And the max level represents really the type of behavior being identified from this botnet. And we can see here that there are some exploitation behaviors being identified. The botnet definition helps security teams consolidate and analyze the various types of behaviors that are being tracked and considered as credential stuffing. Next, we're going to dive into each one of these specific behaviors so that you can understand how the ThreatX platform is detecting various types of credential stuffing activity. First, let's dive into this specific rule identifying 3 unique login attempts from a single IP, all within 1 minute. It's easy to say that this behavior is brute force. Now, because of the type of activity of using login credentials so aggressively, we can start to say that this is a key indicator of credential stuffing. Now, the quantity of match events is what can help us understand really the magnitude of different member bots' behavior. But there's other different types of behaviors that we can expect from credential stuffing outside of attempting to actually log in. Other types of behavior could be similar to business logic abuse, as this example of detecting a weak password being submitted within a login form. Now, this is an active exploitation that we're considering. And this is why it's so popular that not as many botnets are going to be attempting to actually exploit your APIs or your web applications, essentially representing the largest amount of risk of all of the member bots within this credential stuffing botnet. Lastly, now that we've covered brute force, active exploitation, another key indicator that we're tracking around the behavior of this credential stuffing attack is also password spraying. So iterating multiple passwords to try to access this WordPress website. Again, in the example that we mentioned before, if your web application doesn't use WordPress, this will be even more suspicious versus if WordPress was in use. Now that we've reviewed just a few behaviors that are being tracked within this credential stuffing botnet, let's start to dive into how the ThreatX platform is actually detecting these bots. So ThreatX uses a combination of techniques to detect a wide range of automated threats without introducing additional friction like CAPTCHA and other bot mechanisms that negatively impact customers' experience. A few examples of the techniques being used within the platform are first, active interrogation. This is where ThreatX challenges suspicious actors with interrogation to see if they react with tar-pitting traffic or returning web cookies to differentiate a legitimate user versus a bot. Also, ThreatX uses application profiling to automatically identify normal behavior by monitoring usage in underlying services to enable early detection of anomalous behavior. This is an example of how ThreatX detects and tracks threat activity. As we can see here, Hateful de la Plaza tried to attack the authentication endpoint for our specific API all within 1 minute of each other. If we dive into Hateful de la Plaza's activity, we can start to see the metadata that we talked about previously around the user agent, the TLS fingerprint, full path parameters. Here we can see the authentication endpoint is the target, as well as the parameters being passed in. Note the user that's being passed in, and if we view other activities, what we'll start to see is these credentials beginning to rotate through. So in this case, the user changed to get, and if we keep scrolling down, we can see other examples of how this bot is cycling through those various credentials, attempting to gain access. Now, this is just one example of a bot that was detected very early on in its credential stuffing attack. Now, let's hop into a bot that's been automatically blocked with ThreatX's risk-based blocking to understand how the platform will stop attackers in their tracks before gaining access to accounts. Diving back into ThreatX's credential stuffing botnet, let's take a look at one of the bots that was automatically blocked with ThreatX's risk-based blocking. Here within ThreatX's threat entities table, we can start to view a timeline of this bot's specific activity and when he was actually blocked from within the system. There's also a few other request information that's going to be important to call out during this triage period, such as the path being targeted, the user agent that's being used, TLS fingerprint, and also the parameters that are being passed in. Taking a look at this bot's activity, there's a few key attributes that we can notice are starting to change. First is the rotation of user agent. Before July 12th at 1:30, we can see the user agent was focused on a Python request. And just over an hour later, at 2:30 p.m., we can see that user agent changed to a completely different value. Now, let's dive into this specific activity to learn more about what exactly happened during this blocking period. Now that we've expanded this, we can see the specific parameters that were passed in, as well as the rule that was detecting an exploitation attempt of injection, which caused ultimately this bot to go into ThreatX's blocking mode. ThreatX automates risk-based blocking if activity exceeds a specific risk score. This in turn helps the platform stop high-risk transactions instantly and also reduce the amount of manual tasks that security teams need to respond and stop threats. The next example that I'm going to walk through is a low and slow attack. This is where a bot might start reconnaissance earlier on in the attack and slowly advance to a more malicious attack method. Here, I'm going to open up Upset Minges, and we can dive into their activity over time. Here we can see Upset Minges was originally detected on July 7th. And some of the activity that they were performing was mostly reconnaissance with a few brute force examples. However, after 4 days, we can see that Upset Minges came back and now is attempting a DDoS attack on this specific application. Now that we've reviewed Upset Minge's activity over the past 4 days and how it's changed, what we can also see is specific information in that activity and how it's advanced over time. A specific callout that I'd recognize is the change in TLS fingerprint, changes in the user agent. So we can see at one point the user agent was a Chrome MacBook, but is now a Killnet. And also we can see the change in path parameters. And that really represents what's being targeted in this attack. An easier way to see what's being targeted is we can jump over to the endpoint statistics within this entity and see exactly what was being targeted. So here we can recognize that Upset Minges wasn't just targeting our API, but also other paths of our web application. The main target, however, is our authentication endpoint. The next place that we can jump into when trying to understand Upset Minges is also the responsive actions. This is also where we can start to see ThreatX's risk-based blocking starting to take place, where blocks were occurring on July 7th, and also the second block occurred on July 9th. Now, ThreatX tracks bot activity. So if this bot continues to come back 3 times, at the 3rd time, it'll be automatically added to our permanent block list. And that's really how ThreatX combats both the aggressive volumetric bots as well as the low and slow bots attempting to evade detection. Jumping back to ThreatX's Credential Stuffing botnet, it's important to emphasize that security teams are always trying to keep up with changing attack patterns, as this requires constant correlation from various sources to get a complete picture of what's happening. In this example, I'm going to walk through how your security team can add additional definitions to a botnet to account for how behaviors are advancing or changing over time. Taking a look at all of the members' various behavior, we can start to see the various types of rules being detected. As we reviewed, one of the key rules that are being tracked within this botnet is the 3 unique login. But also what we can start to see is other rules being triggered, such as the block login relay parameters. Let's dive in and investigate this rules behavior a little bit more and see if this is something that we want to start to track and consolidate within our credential stuffing botnet. Jumping into all the attackers that are matching against the block login relay parameters rule, we can start to see that there's a high activity of threats that are starting to use this behavior. A number of them do identify as credential stuffing, but most of them are being tracked as potentially bad traffic. This could be a key example of how a botnet is advancing its behavior and how we can start to consolidate this view even more by adding this rule to the credential stuffing botnet. So jumping back to the botnet, it's very simple to actually add additional criteria. We can simply edit the botnet, And we can add this rule to the definition very easily from within the botnet dashboard. After looking up and now saving this rule to our botnet, we'll start to see other bots starting to be brought into our credential stuffing botnet that continue to match both behaviors now. With ThreatX's botnet console, security teams get visibility into how effective their current rules are detecting and blocking botnets, coupled with the ability to update rule criteria fast and easily, enabling teams to constantly improve the effectiveness of their bot protection. Thank you everybody for joining this demonstration of how ThreatX can help your security teams block credential stuffing at scale. Next, we're going to move into a live Q&A with our Director of Security Operations, Neil Weitzel. Good afternoon, Neil. Thank you so much for joining us for this live Q&A. We really appreciate the time today. Would you like to start the Q&A just by giving us a high-level introduction of yourself and your background?
Sure, yeah, glad to be here. So my name is Neil Weitzel. I am the Director of Security Operations at ThreatX. My background mainly comes from operations as well as kind of application security in general, kind of like a breaker of many things. And so that's kind of lended itself into making sure that we stop attacks here at ThreatX and kind of leveraging our Layer 7 solution to protect web applications and API platforms.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I want to encourage the audience, if you do have any questions from this demonstration, please don't be shy to post them in our chat and we'll make sure to cover them during the duration of this live Q&A. However, we do have some questions already in the chat. So Neil, we're curious to dig into, has the ThreatX SOC identified any specific industries or company sizes that you're seeing getting targeted by credential stuffing attacks?
Definitely. Essentially, any kind of company that has logins or authenticated areas of their applications, and this can be both for APIs as well as normal websites that you may visit like just with your browser. We do definitely see credential stuffing attacks kind of across any industry, but we see them most prevalently kind of in banks and in credit unions. And over Q2, they just kind of wrapped up not too long ago, it accounted for about 8% of the anomalous traffic that we analyzed, just credential stuffing in general. So like things that we already were able to profile, we were like, okay, so we're seeing this kind of hit a lot of our banks, credit unions, financial institutions, and that's likely because there's money right behind that, and if you can get into there, you pretty much have access to people's funds. So that explains why they're definitely one of the bigger targets. But we definitely see this as well within any kind of industry that has login or authenticated pages. Lots of products as well, like you might think like SaaS solutions or software.
And Neil, I'm curious to just dig in a little bit more. What do you think are some of the main reasons why credential stuffing attacks are so prevalent nowadays? And in turn, why do you think they're so successful?
Well, yeah, I think that a lot of this comes down to you're using known good information in a lot of senses, right? So you typically have like known good passwords that you have procured through some fashion, and since most people don't like to change their passwords and they like to reuse them in a lot of cases, it's like, all right, well, let me go ahead and try this on other sites that likely these users or this user base may also have enough overlap with that I might be able to find accounts to reuse. So I think that's why they're seen as a pretty easy target or a pretty easy attack vector. And similarly, like the sophistication needed really to run through a list of known usernames and passwords is not as advanced as like perhaps trying to craft like a very unique payload to exploit a known vulnerability in infrastructure or software. Whereas, logging in with a username and password is pretty trivial to figure out because it's supposed to be intuitive for the customers and users anyway.
Perfect. Thank you so much for kind of explaining that and walking through some of the specific details, Neil. We have another question in the chat from some of our attendees. How do cyber criminals acquire large databases of stolen credentials that you've heard of in your experience?
So this usually comes in with usually either buying them or they'll infiltrate like a less secure system. Like we talked about, this being a little bit around banks or financial institutions as we see as like their main targets. However, for someone to get that, they're usually having to target something that's less secure or an area where they were able to snag those credentials that had already been infiltrated. So, I think like some of the ones that I've personally seen, were along the lines of like community websites that I had used previously, like for when I'd stayed at like an apartment complex or things of that nature. And then later I found out that those places were breached. But if I had not used different passwords for every single one of my services, those credentials may have been good to use elsewhere on perhaps like my banking site or one of my investment things or things of that nature.
Now, I know that you mentioned that one of the most common ways that you've experienced credentials, getting stolen is through those community websites. But I'm just curious to kind of dig in a little bit more. What potential liabilities would some of those companies experience if they were breached and had sensitive information stolen from their customers?
Yeah, I think it's really important that anybody who has like authenticated users or that they maintain like identification or like identity and access management within their own platform, that they should be monitoring like the normal paste bin type sites or community sites where people might be sharing this type of information or this type of data may be leaked. So because of that, because as a company or proprietor of software or of your users, they have like a general expectation that the software and services are going to be secure. And if for some reason they're not, it's kind of the company's responsibility to make sure that they send out notice, instructions of actions that the users can take, and in some cases even compensation, because this is a huge brand or company reputation that is now at stake in some of these regards because of if my account is compromised and lots of other ones are, you're going to think twice about using it or keeping your data there. And I think that that's kind of where we talk about what their responsibility or what they're liable for. It's like as a customer you have an expectation, and then anything that kind of deviates from that expectation you want notice, instructions, and you want to feel good about moving forward with that company or if you're going to keep your stuff there or continue to use their product.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense. Being the cybersecurity expert that you are, what are some specific instructions that you could share with folks on how they can protect themselves against credential stuffing attacks?
Go change your password. Like literally right now, after you get off the webinar here, just go change your passwords. Like keeping a rotation, good digital hygiene, as we would say, is going to be one of the best things, because you don't know who is always infiltrated when and how old your passwords are unless you're keeping track of that. And to that point, like using something like a password manager can help significantly with these things, because a lot of those now have built-in tracking, like, hey, your account was compromised, it was seen in this breach, which correlate with things like have I been pwned, or other data sources that kind of track this on either dark web or known community sites. So password managers can help a lot. The other thing that I harp on just adamantly is use multi-factor authentication. If there is an option for it, you should have it enabled on any and every software platform, site, credentials that you use. And if it's not an option, should you be using that software is like my follow-up question. Like if it's not something that you can enable, are they really as secure as a software platform or as an identity and access management proprietor as you want to be? And maybe that's a put in a support ticket, ask those questions.
Absolutely, absolutely. Cybersecurity is becoming more and more a responsibility of everybody, and it's just part of taking the onus. I realize we're nearing the end of our live Q&A, so I want to wrap up with one last question. What advice would you share to other security teams that are struggling to combat credential stuffing attacks?
Oh, goodness. If you are struggling to combat credential stuffing attacks, the best things that we always try to do is we will look at what's been normal and under what normal circumstances are, and we try to like set thresholds and deviations away from that of what is abnormal. Because once we have a good baseline, it's easier to spot things that kind of fall outside that baseline. What makes credential stuffing like more difficult is that it can look very normal and very much like a normal person logging in or traffic. You have to look for very good cues and signs. Like we have a lot of abilities to do things like enforce flows or interrogate people as they visit endpoints or try to log in. And if you have those types of capabilities where somebody should visit a login page before submitting the login credentials, that's one thing. If they should be only visiting your page with a browser, that's another thing. But you have to kind of limit like what your use cases are and enumerate your abuse cases so that you can really kind of like carve out surgically exactly what you want to block or what you want to aggregate risk on. And to kind of like your point, what you were saying during your demo was, we aggregate that through risk, which gives us like a really unique opportunity to identify and track things and then aggregate the risk to block them as, block would-be attackers as they do something a little bit more nefarious rather than just doing things based off of a signature or one action. So that really gives us a lot more flexibility and being sure no false positives, not blocking, maybe somebody who just like fat fingered their password a couple of times.
Yeah, we would ideally like to avoid blocking grandma from accessing her bank account as much as possible.
For sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Neil, for joining the live Q&A. We really appreciate the time together today, answering some of the audience members' questions.
Glad to be here.
And I want to thank everybody else who hopped on and joined us today for the ThreatX platform demonstration of blocking credential stuffing attacks at scale. If you aren't already, follow ThreatX on LinkedIn for notifications of future events, and we look forward to seeing you next time.